Good evening. I'm Bob Boyers, and on behalf of William Kennedy and Don Faulkner of the Writers Institute in Albany, and my Associate Director, Melora Wolf of the Summer Institute, I'm pleased to welcome you to the opening night of the 26th Annual New York State Summer Writers Institute. The schedules at the back of the room on the book table will tell you what's to come over the next weeks in the way of public events, most of them scheduled for this very room. But I want you to note that our weekend Saturday night film screenings and discussions are scheduled for next door in Emerson Auditorium. And I will remind our audience every night during this month that a reception follows these weeknight events across the green in the spa in the basement of Case College Center. As pretty much always, we have two readers tonight, and I'll introduce first Elizabeth Benedict, and then, when it is his turn, Philip Lopate. Lots of talk in literary circles nowadays about the intersection of fiction and memoir. The talk, occasionally smart and helpful, more often not so helpful. Say the word intention, and you have a very preliminary way to begin thinking about this sort of issue, though then, of course, you may quickly decide it really isn't much of an issue and move on to more important things. Like what? Like how to distinguish between what's worth talking about and what isn't. Thoughts, at any rate, inspired by an encounter with the work of Elizabeth Benedict, who has given us, by my count, 5 terrific novels and a wide range of other things, including a compact, much-admired book on how to write about sex in fiction. Talk about knowing what's important. Is the boundary between fiction and memoir a concern of Liz Benedict's fiction? Not that I've noticed. You read her most recent novel, The Practice of Deceit, and you might entertain the thought that it is based upon the writer's very own experience of marital discord and revenge, or upon the experience of someone she has known. But then you think, maybe, who cares really, what this lively and engaging novel is or isn't based on when it is so adeptly responsive to its own laws and logic. Are Liz's characters in such a novel drawn, as they say, from the life, or from, capital letters, life? They appear to be, which is to say that we relate to them, love them, or despise them, as if we might actually know them. But then they are, at the same time, clearly invented characters, belonging unmistakably to a constructed narrative in which they play their necessary and appointed parts, free, to be sure, but free only as they must be if they are to serve the several purposes to which they have been assigned. And is that the case with the persons or personages we meet in a memoir? Not exactly, I think, though it's not easy to say wherein lies the difference. Liz Benedict's most recently published fiction is a story called Paris in the 20s. I know it's not supposed to be read as memoir because on its first page it says, just beneath the title, a story. And yet, the thing seems as if it might actually be a memoir, so confiding is the first-person voice, so easy is it with the detailed knowledge it imparts, so comfortable is it dwelling on small things and avoiding large, clamorous, universalizing claims. And yet, to be sure, a story, a fiction. How so? In the author's refusal to make things too entirely comprehensible, in her unwillingness to tie too neatly the moral shoelaces of her characters, to sum them too tidily up. Though she knows these people, we feel, knows them through and through, they exist for her and thus for her reader, as if there were things in each of them unreachable. They remain, so we feel, secrets, privacies, and the fiction exists, at least in part, to demonstrate how far the imagination can go to set a story out and account for things, while affirming that in the end, even the people and events most near, best known to us, are mysterious and bottomless. That, I think, is the gift we want and expect, certainly from fiction, and that is what we find in the work of Elizabeth Benedict. And so, here, to lead us off on our 26th summer season and to demonstrate her moves as a writer of nonfiction is Elizabeth Benedict.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, welcome. It's a pleasure, always a pleasure and an honor to be here. And it's always a pleasure to be here because I see a lot of people who come a year again and again. And for people who are new here, who haven't been here, you'll soon find out why all these people are coming back year after year. And part of the reason is because of the atmosphere that's created by Bob and Peg, and by Don Faulkner, and by William Kennedy, and Melora Wolf, who make this a really special place for all of us. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I told Bob that I was going to be reading fiction, and then something happened. And I wrote something in the last few weeks that isn't fiction. And so we'll see what happens. I might be writing something like a memoir, which I'm not sure that I am, like a book memoir. And if I am writing it, it might be a series of confessions. And so this is one of the confessions. I'm not going to give you the title of the confession in the book, but if it's a standalone piece, it's called Looking for Work. And I think if it's a book, it'll be the beginning of the book. If it's not, I don't know what it's going to be. So Looking for Work. And there's this light is bad. Wait a second. Looking for Work. I still remember the dress I wore to my first lunch with Morty, an abomination, the only one I owned. A navy blue stretchy cotton knit thing that hung halfway down my calves in an inelegant drape like a flag on a windless day. It had short sleeves, a scoop neck, a small orange flower design, and a stretchy waistline whose elastic had started to go because it was so old. My long dark hair cascaded over my shoulders and down my back in a tribute to Joan Baez, even though it was 1980 and not 1963. And I was in Washington, D.C. looking for a job, not at the Café Wa singing Blowin' in the Wind on an acoustic guitar. Looking for a job because I had just been fired from the job I had moved from San Francisco to Washington to take 2 months before. Morty Leeds, a high-level civil servant at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, was reading my resume at a lunch table in the employees' cafeteria at HUD and getting ready to give me advice, I hoped, about how to jazz it up for my job hunt. We had a mutual friend who had told me I should call him because he had a hobby helping people who'd been riffed rewrite their resumes. I was new to Washington, but it had been explained to me already that RIF, R-I-F, stood for Reduction in Forces, and that RIFT was government speak for fired. There had been no euphemism, no riffing when I lost my own job. It was just a lousy fit between what my boss wanted and what I could do, and he had no hard feelings. It is never pleasant to be turned away, but it was not a crushing blow, nor much of a surprise. Mostly I was anxious because I had only 3 months' rent and utilities in the bank and no one to help me when that ran out. Sitting across from Morty Leeds, a kindly gray-haired man then in his 50s, I was happy for any advice he might offer. He looked up and made a pronouncement over our empty plates that had nothing to do with rewriting my resume. "You have to do something about your clothes and your hair," he said, "but once you do, you can have a fabulous career, moving in and out of government, working for advocacy groups and think tanks, influencing policy from all angles." He might as well have punched me. I don't mean the crack about my appearance, which seemed to me a badge of honor. That I couldn't figure out how to put myself together meant I had better things to think about. It was his career plan that caught me up short. That sounds awful, I said. Shoot me now. I might as well have punched him back. What? He said. He couldn't have heard me right. Awful, I repeated. But your resume is so impressive. What do you want to do? My resume had a fictional quality in that I failed to mention the job from which I'd just been fired as the press secretary to one of the most liberal congressmen in the House of Representatives. It seems unfathomable to me now that I had such a job, but it was no less unfathomable then, as unlikely as it would have been for me to work at the Pentagon or in a gas station. I have only the vaguest memory of applying for the job. I know I must have interviewed for it on a trip to Washington when I lived and worked in San Francisco as a publicist for a Latino civil rights organization. That, too, had been unlikely, a job I got primarily because I could type fast, but it turned out to have been to have fit quite well, turned out to have been a good idea I'd never thought of. But as a New Yorker well into my third year in San Francisco, where I'd gone on a lark after college, I was lonely and tired of being so far from home and wanted eventually to work my way back to New York. My experience at the Civil Rights Organization, whose Washington office I had visited several times, had given me a taste of Potomac fever. On one of those business trips to Washington, a reporter friend told me about the job with the congressman, who had also been impressed with my resume. Though I was not a lawyer and not a trained journalist, and only several years out of college, I had somehow learned to navigate certain waters involving legal issues, minority rights, and the national press. I wrote speeches and press releases about our class action lawsuits, traveled the country with the president telling her what to say to reporters, and pitched stories to the press about immigration, bilingual education, and voting rights at a time when Cesar Chavez and the farm workers were about the only Mexican Americans on mainstream radar. In college, I'd been a creative writing major, an unlikely candidate to stumble 18 months later into this prominent organization with offices around the country. Until then, while I lived la vie bohème in San Francisco, I'd been doing office temp work for $5 an hour and dating the editor of the San Francisco Review of Books, in whose company I met writers, read galleys, and wrote occasional reviews. The relationship ended about the same time I lost my appetite for being the girl whose job was to buy coffee and cigarettes for the boss. The Civil Rights Group had gotten a grant to hire someone to manage a media mailing list. The woman who interviewed me asked if I'd mind typing half-time. I said I wouldn't. I typed all the time anyway, writing poems and short stories. She said, "There are plenty of people who've applied for this job who have more experience than you do," not surprising since I had none, "but no one who can type as fast." I was a 23-year-old Jewish girl from Manhattan who'd won the poetry prize at Barnard and liked to read Henry James and Virginia Woolf. Everything beyond typing that I did in that office for the next 2 years, I made up as I went along or learned on the job, including my crash course in civil rights law and Mexican-American history and culture. I knew from Watergate that Attorney General John Mitchell had been a crook, but I had no idea what the Attorney General's job was when not being crooked. In the early weeks and months at the job, I'd go home at night in a semi-panic and pepper one of my housemates, a law student, with questions. What's a circuit court? What's an amicus brief? What's a writ of certiorari? What's Title VII? How am I ever going to make sense of all of this? Once my panic subsided, I became very good at explaining these matters to the press and public who didn't understand them because I had so recently dwelled in darkness myself. And I was thrilled to find that the more I learned about the law and culture and how to communicate it to outsiders, the more all of it mattered to me. This was my own private civics course, my intimate history of the West, a three-dimensional reminder that much of California and the Southwest used to be Mexico. So purely by accident, I'd become a spokesperson for the nascent Hispanic civil rights movement, an Anglo with an unexpected investment in these exotic narratives of migration, conquest, discrimination, and sometimes triumph. But by the end of 1979, I was a straight, single 25-year-old woman itching to flee San Francisco for someplace less beautiful and more substantial. My description of the city by the bay in those days, nice house, nobody home, marked me as a hardcore Northeasterner, a denizen of the Boston-Washington corridor, not a California dreamer. Now Morty Leeds asked what I wanted to do with myself, since I clearly didn't want the career he'd envisioned for me. I want to be a writer. Right now I just need a job to pay my bills, but I'd like it to be an interesting job. I see, he said, fiction or poetry. I was clearly in that ragtag category of poets or fiction writers. Those were the only choices back then if you declared yourself a writer or a want-to-be, unless you specified playwright or screenwriter. Journalists were called journalists or reporters, and writing personal essays and memoir was not common enough to be a subspecialty, much less a thriving genre and a subject in which you can get a PhD. The personal prose of, say, Annie Dillard and Joan Didion, who had each published only 2 books of prose by then, was a rarity. It was understood that theirs were particular gifts, like those belonging to great musicians or choreographers, a Heifetz or a Balanchine, and only the most confident dared yearn in those directions. We are talking here about the age of the horse and buggy, before the great democratization of writing, before the Mac and the PC, when cutting and pasting involved the physical labor of rewriting, involved scissors, glue, tape, and the personal conviction of an abolitionist. Fiction, I told Morty Leeds across the cafeteria table. I want to write novels. In 1980, in Washington, D.C., there might have been a dozen people who wanted to write literary novels or were writing them, including Larry McMurtry, Ward Just, and Susan Shreve, maybe 24. I hoped that I was about to be one of them, but in the meantime I needed a job, something like what I had done in San Francisco, promoting a cause I cared about or could come to care about. A week before this lunch, soon after being fired by the congressman, I had applied for a publicist job at a prison reform organization and thought that I would have been happy to learn about that and bring attention to the cause. But seeking work in places that were straighter and more established, the Brookings Institute, the Smithsonian, never occurred to me, especially after my disastrous stint on Capitol Hill. "What do you like about your job?" the congressman's chief of staff asked me casually one evening, once it was clear that I was not the hire they had expected me to be. Someone who mainlined the news from Nicaragua and spent her time drafting impassioned floor speeches and newsletter articles on the arcane maneuvers of the Sandinistas and the Contras. What I liked best about my job was the Watts line, a government phone system that gave us free long-distance calls. Then a great luxury. I spoke regularly, frantically, to my best friend in Oregon. I must have made up I spoke regularly, frantically, to my best friend in Oregon in coded language about how much I hated working on the Hill. I must have made up some nonsense to tell the chief of staff, which of course he knew better than to believe. Walking into the Rayburn House office building, where the Congress is located, every morning and down the stately halls to the congressman's door made me feel as though I had stumbled into the invasion of the body snatchers. All the bodies were inhabited by pods that had turned them into zombies, dull young men and women dressed for preppy success, eager to be noticed and move up the ranks in this world of surfaces and sellouts. Like Holden Caulfield, I saw phonies everywhere, phony smiles, phony phone calls, and phony professions of respect, courtesy, and good intention. And sometimes things I hadn't expected, there's a word missing, maudlin sentimentality in the guise of official business. If I remember correctly, one day my boss read a tribute to his mother on the floor of the House. Had he asked me to write or edit it, would that have been one of my duties? This has escaped my memory. I knew that some of what happened on the Hill mattered. It was not all tributes to mothers, though those seemed popular. And I knew that the man I worked for was one of the very good guys. But since I had no ambition to become part of the world of policy and politics, while I marked my time, what mattered to me was my relationship to the material. Working on the Hill made me realize that I wanted to be among the righteous, creating a ruckus from the outside, not a staffer attempting to make the ship of state run smoothly. It was a wonder I had lasted a month. Morty Leeds didn't help me get a job or rewrite my resume. He invited me to lunch at HUD every few months and took an avuncular interest in me. Early on, I loaned him a novel I loved, An American Romance by John Casey, And a long time later, Morty confessed to me that because there was a good bit of sex in the book, his wife was convinced that I was making a pass at him. A critic friend described the novel as Henry James with sex, but the sex was all that Mrs. Leeds noticed. I don't think Morty believed his wife's conclusion for a second. I never discussed my desultory love life with him. Desultory is putting it charitably, but he might have guessed that civil servants in their 50s were not my type. The prison reform organization never called me for an interview, and no one else with the job did either. But soon after my first lunch with Morty, I had what turned out to be a good idea. Because of my work in San Francisco, I knew that the Federal Voting Rights Act would expire in August of 1982. It was then early 1980. And I knew how important it was for the organization that it be renewed. It protected the voting rights of Mexican Americans in Texas, where our organization had a thriving office. I made a proposal to the Washington office that I would oversee the lobbying effort to extend the Voting Rights Act, and they hired me back for that gig. Soon, the newly elected President Reagan and Senator Strom Thurmond, the well-known racist who turned out to have a black daughter, would vow to kill the landmark legislation because it had been so successful increasing minority voting and representation. For the next 2 years, I worked with an historic coalition of civil rights, voting rights, and labor groups to ensure that the Voting Rights Act would last beyond the 1982 expiration date. We managed to get it extended for 25 more years, and when that day came in 2007, long after my involvement, even the Bush administration could not kill it. It's in effect to this day. Unsavory members of Congress still make stabs at eviscerating it. Local politicians, the governor of Florida, for instance, still publicly defy it, and Karl Rove invests heavily in disenfranchising voters throughout the land, far beyond the South and Southwest, where the Voting Rights Act was designed to correct a long history of suppressing and diluting minority votes. But this is quite another story, though it is often the story that I care most about in the world. For the 2 years I worked on the bill, I had planned to quit my job in August of 1982 and take up waitressing and bartending and finish my first novel, which I had begun a year before on a long vacation. Instead, I got lucky. I was laid off in August of '82 and finished the novel while collecting unemployment insurance in an apartment in Mount Pleasant, several blocks from the Washington, D.C. Zoo, whose roaring lions I often heard early in the morning from my bedroom. I had followed Grace Paley's advice for writers and kept my overhead low, dwelling in a grungy basement overlooking an alley for $250 a month. The landlord was kind enough not to raise the rent for the 3 years I lived there. In exchange, I wouldn't file a complaint against him for the absence of a heating system. That winter, I wrote my novel at a card table in the kitchen, a space about 7 feet by 7 feet, including appliances, with the oven door open at my back and the heat turned to 350 degrees. At night, in the long, narrow bedroom, whose ceiling wasn't more than 6.5 feet from the floor, I used a crappy little space heater whose rattly hum I hear in my head when I remember the place. I still thank my stars it never went up in flames. In January 1984, my agent sold the novel about a young woman immigration lawyer in Los Angeles who sleeps with all the wrong people to Lee Gerner at Knopf. He was the editor who had published Michael Hare's Dispatches and several of Don DeLillo's novels. 6 months later, on a visit to Washington, Lee came to my apartment. I can't remember why now. It made such an impression on him that he called my agent the next day and said, "You've got to get her more money. She can't keep living there." When the novel came out, it was greeted with more attention than any of us had expected, and I was famous for 10 or 15 minutes. But on the January day the deal came through, I was still in pajamas when my agent told me that the editor would soon be calling. I don't know what I had planned to say in this state of semi-shock and blessed relief, but as soon as Lee announced himself, I blurted out, "I'm so glad you called. I had to borrow $800 yesterday." Thank you.